Hi, it's Debra at Laurie's Country Cottage. Welcome to How Tuesday. Today I'm going to talk about getting yourself into making rag quilts. When the Timber Nomies line came into the store late summer, I fell in love with all of these flannels and I decided that I was going to make a rag quilt. Why a rag quilt? Because they're quick and easy and they're fun to make. I hope you'll join me. To get started making your rag quilt, you're going to need a few supplies, but it's not that bad. Everyone has a pair of little snips that we're going to be using for cutting our threads off, and perhaps even if you want to make your snips into the ragging of the quilt, but I actually recommend these snips that are meant for making rag quilts. They're extremely sturdy, they have a very short blade, and at the end of the blade is a blunt tip, so that you're not going to be cutting right to a very sharp point and poking it through your fabric. The beauty of these little scissors is that they're spring-loaded and they help return the shear to the open position after you've made every cut. Short blade, blunt tip, spring-loaded. This version of these shears, similar, short blade, blunt tip, spring-loaded, but it has a handle that will stay on your hand. And I can imagine that this might be a little easier for a child to work with just because it won't drop out of their hand. To make your cutting, you're going to need the rotary cutter and ruler. I love my 6-inch by 24-inch ruler and my 6-inch by 12-inch ruler. These are the ones that I have constantly in hand for making rag quilts. I'll give you a recipe for a rag quilt in a second. But of course, the other thing that you're going to need is fabric. You can, of course, buy yard goods. You can figure out how much you want to put into this quilt, how big you want your quilt to be, and you can just come and buy yardage for the fabric. But I also make pajama pants for the family every Christmas, and over the years I've accumulated masses and masses of scraps. So one way I deal with those scraps is to create the squares for rag quilts right as I'm cleaning up after doing that sewing. Let's take a look at how you're going to be doing your cutting and some simple measurements to figure out how much fabric you're going to need. The basic size square that I like to use in these quilts is the 6-inch square. Calculating that I'm going to have a 1/2-inch seam allowance, that means my finalized square is going to end up being a 5-inch space. That makes it really easy to figure out how big and how much fabric I want to put into it. If I made a quilt that was 9 squares wide and 11 squares long, I would end up needing about 5 meters of fabric. Remember that each one of these squares is a double layer, and that's producing both the front and the back of your quilt. So if you're worried and you think, oh, wow, 5 meters, that's a lot for such a tiny little quilt, remember you're making both the front and back layers at the same time. If you wanted that quilt to be 11 squares wide and 13 squares long, you're going to need about 7.5 meters of total yardage. And if you wanted a really big one that ends up at about 65 by 75, which would be 13 by 15, you're going to need about 10 meters of yardage. Now, I don't always buy the full 10 meters though, because as I've been sewing pajama pants throughout the history of my family, I always end up with, just at the end of that sewing, I end up with some scraps. I've also ended up with some flannel scraps from putting flannel on the back of quilts. So I'll often have these little tiny pieces, maybe they're 0.3 of a meter, maybe they're just a little strip that came off the side edge of my cutting, and I prepare those as much as I can by cutting those up and having them stored away and ready to go. So I'll set this up and we'll look at how I cut my scraps. I'm ready to start cutting into my scraps, whether those be from garment making or quilt backs that are left over. I just want to cut my pieces and then store them away and get rid of all that extraneous fabric. When I have a large scrap like this that looks like I'm going to be able to get at least a 6-inch square out of it, I get as many 6-inch squares as I can, and then as a last resort, so that I'm using as much as possible, I will also cut 3.5 by 6-inch pieces, because 2 two of them will be able to be sewn across the middle and will combine to form a 6-inch square. So when you stick these little squares, there's a little bit of extra ragging in your quilt, and there's a little bit of a surprise in the design. So that creates a little bit of a dynamic pattern. My scrap fabric that I've got here, you can see that I have laid wrong sides together. That's because flannel is great for cohesion. It's going to stick to itself, and once I cut those two layers, I will have cut both the front and back layer of my quilt, and I may as well cut it like that in its position, and I don't have to move them before I sew them. I've laid wrong sides together. I'm ready to just find what I think is my best impression of lengthwise or crosswise grain, and I am going to, and have already done it, I am going to run my ruler straight along that edge and then cut off any little bits of fabric that are sticking out over the edge. I want to be able to deal with these scraps as quickly as possible, so I want to make as many big pieces as I can. So I've just flipped my fabric over. I'm now going to place this on the 6-inch marking. And I'm ready to make a swipe with my fabric. I like to use the 60mm rotary cutter for this because it can be fatiguing to do a lot of cutting and moving around, and the 60mm cutter just slices through that very, very quickly. This little piece is no longer useful for me, and since I'm already using scraps, I don't feel bad about throwing something like that away. Then I'll quickly switch to my 6x12-inch ruler. And just by lining up one of the horizontal lines on the ruler, I'll clean up that edge, and then I will flip it over and I'll start cutting, because I'm a right-handed person and should be cutting on the right-hand side of the ruler. I will start cutting my squares across. As I accumulate the squares, I lay them in a pile. I don't bother separating those layers because it's not necessary, but I lay them in piles, alternating the corners, so that I can do a quick count and I can mark on the bag or the container that I store these in. I can mark how many squares I've actually cut and accumulated for a particular quilt. This last piece is not going to give me a 6-inch square, but it is going to give me a 3.5-inch piece. So over time, I will be able to accumulate enough of them so that I can lay them together and add them to my quilt as extra fabric that's usable. I'll just clear this away, and then I'll come back with how I would go and cut yard goods that I had purchased fresh from the store. So we look at the fabric on the bolt, and we can see that this particular fabric has been folded with the right sides out, so that's great. I'll be able to get started on that right away. But you can see that there's a little bit of crookedness on the end of the bolt. So when I buy that fabric, the amounts that I gave you did allow you a little bit of extra so that you can make those straightening cuts. I've chosen this particular piece of fabric. It's left over from the back of a previous quilt, and you can see that this edge has been ripped. So I know that that is the on-grain line on that, but it's not lining up exactly perfectly. But I'm going to do my best. If you really want to pull it perfectly onto grain, you can take the time to do that. I'm going to do my best because this is just using scraps up, and I don't want to spend a lot of time worrying about that kind of thing. So I'm doing my best to get it lined up, and then I'm going to cut my squares from that point. Each of these squares is going to be a 6-inch piece, and it's not going to create a great deal of a problem. Again, with my right sides out and my new fabric folded, I am going to find a nice straight edge against the fold, and I'm going to clean up that outer edge. And then I'm just flipping it because I'm a right-handed cutter, and I am going to cut at the 6-inch line. Now, ordinarily, we wouldn't put the selvage edge into our quilts, and I don't do that with these quilts either. So I'm just going to fold that piece, just make sure it's laying as flat as I can, and I'm just going to begin by cutting off the selvage. This particular one is a little bit wide. I can sneak about 1/4 of an inch in because it's just going to get ragged anyways. But I just want to get rid of that edge because it is a little harder and it's a little more firmly woven, so it won't rag up as nicely as the actual internal part of the fabric. Now I'm ready to do my cross cutting. So I get out my trusty 6-inch ruler and I'm making my cuts. The question was asked of me, do you pre-wash your fabric? So if I'm sewing garments, all of those fabrics are going to have been pre-washed before they were put into garments. All of the fabrics that I've bought new from the store, generally, if I do something like the quilt behind me where I'm just using that whole line brand new from the store, I didn't bother to pre-wash that fabric because I'm going to end up washing it to rag it anyways. But if I'm trying to mix two different kinds of textiles, yeah, I probably would wash my yard goods if I was going to mix it with fabric that I'd already pre-washed. So you'll notice that every 6 inches of brand new fabric, or 0.15 when you buy it in metric, is going to give you 3 double squares. That's the front and back of your quilt, plus the potential for either a complete set of a 3.5 by 6 or a half set of 3.5 by 6. So this is all going to depend on how much of that selvage has to come off, how much you're actually going to get. So when I calculated the amounts of 5 meters, 7.5, and 10 meters for those 3 sizes, I just counted on having these 3 squares taken out of every 0.15. Then it's a bonus if you can get some extra size on your quilt or some extra squares by cutting those. This little piece now I don't want in my work, and I'm going to get it off to the side so that it doesn't get mixed up with anything that I'm working with. When I come back, I'll show you how you would lay these out and get started on the sewing. Once you've got your squares all cut, and remember for a 9 by 11 quilt, that would be 99 double sets of squares. For 11 by 13, that would be 143, and 13 by 15 would be a lot. I think it's 165, but don't count me on that. Once you've got that done, it's now up to you to lay out your quilt in the organization that you want. Some of my prints are one-way direction only, and some are just randomly placed on there. So that I don't have to worry about that, I on purpose don't put them so that they're all right side up. I just let it be random so that I don't have to worry about that throughout the whole quilt. This little tiny quilt that I've got here that's 5 by 2, I would lay out my rows, decide on my final design, and then I'm ready to start pulling it together. The quickest thing I can do is to match the first 2 of every row, and a quick way to sew is by chaining. So I am going to just simply match these 2 pieces up, and I'm going to lay them down. And I know that's the edge that I'm going to be sewing. These next 2 are going to go down, and that's the edge I'm going to be sewing. So you can go to the trouble of marking your rows with pins to tell you what's row 1, etc., etc. But in a very randomized quilt, it's probably not going to matter anyways. I'm just piling these up and getting them ready to sew. So I tend to do the first 2 of every row, sew them, and then lay them back on their row. Then come and do the next 2 of every row. I want my squares to be the back sides together so that my 1/2 inch seam allowance will show up on what is going to technically be the front of the quilt. So I did my first column of the first 2 blocks, then I'll do my second column of the second 2 blocks, and so on. And that way, the order in which I sew them just remains consistent, and I don't have to stop and mark my rows or my columns. So I've got a row of my squares in whatever design it was that I was going to put them in. I've got them all together. Just a reminder, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So even though I've started off with a 6-inch square, my finished size is going to be 5 inches. And you can see that I just inserted one of those little random one that's half of the size of the original square. And I am ready now to lay out all my rows and to join them together. When I go to join the rows, I'm going to lay the back side up so that this seam sticks out from the other layer, and I'm simply going to match those corners, and I'm going to stitch along with a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way along. So let's step and take a look at this quilt behind me. I've made my rows and they're all ready to be put together. So when I go to put together, I am going to do my best to match those corners. My pieced corners are going to be thick, so I'm going to match the corner. And I'm going to try to lay one seam allowance going one way and one the other way, and hope that they just sort of nest in there and mesh together. And so I'm going to do my best to get a matching corner, but on the front of the quilt, that's all going to disappear anyway. So don't be too hard on yourself or hard on the person you're teaching to sew, because that is all going to rag out and just cover those seam allowances anyway. So it's an easy starter quilt, beginner quilt for someone that just wants to get into the process of sewing. The last thing that you're going to need to do with your quilt once you've got it constructed is you're going to need to rag those edges. So I talked before about these little scissors. They're beautiful. The blunt end can be bumped up into the edge. So when I do this, I'm usually sitting in a chair watching TV because it can get a little boring. I push that blunt end up toward the seam and then lean back and cut. And that way I won't cut my stitching line. But if I do happen to cut my stitching line, no problem. I just have to go back and restitch it. So to make it easy to find that stitching line again, I just insert a safety pin there, and it's going to be an obvious marker of where I've made that error in my cutting. So I'm cutting each strip about 1/2 inch apart with my little snips, and I tend to try to do it in an organized fashion. I go down all the rows and then I go down all the columns. If you want, when you're making these pieces that are two pieces together, you can lay that seam open, and that will then just create a little less bulk in that area. And you can rag these before you sew the row together. It's just one little step that you can have already done. Ragging can be actually quite quick, but the really important thing is hand fatigue that is really alleviated by these little scissors that bounce back. When you're done getting all of your snips made in the ragging, you then have two choices as to how this quilt is going to end up. You can run a zigzag 1/2 inch away from the edge, and you can just rag your edges, or you can bind it like I've done this one with just a regular quilt binding. I hope you'll give rag quilts a try. They really are that fun and easy. Thanks for watching How Tuesday.